They were dropped from the sky into a frozen wasteland, miles behind enemy lines, with nothing but a parachute, a rifle, and the knowledge that they were surrounded. The temperature was 20 degrees below zero. The enemy was everywhere. But the biggest battle these men faced wasn't against the North Korean army waiting in the dark. It was against the United States Army that had sent them there. The generals in the Pentagon had written a report stating that black soldiers lacked the intelligence, the initiative, and the courage to be special operations warriors. They said a black man could dig a ditch or drive a truck, but he could never be a ranger. They were wrong. This is the story of the only all-black Special Forces unit in American history. A group of men who took the most elite title the military had to offer and drenched it in their own blood and glory. Before we jump into the fire with them, I want to see who's holding the line with us today. We are building a community of people who respect real history here. So do me a favor. Go down to the comments right now and sound off with your city and state. Let's map out exactly where the real patriots are watching from today. Check in below, and let's get into it. Imagine the United States Army in 1950. 5 years had passed since the end of World War II, the war that was supposed to kill fascism and prove that freedom was the ultimate power. But inside the American military machine, the old rot of racism was still eating away at the foundation. President Truman had signed the order to desegregate the military 2 years prior, but a signature on a piece of paper in Washington does not change the hearts of men in the barracks. The Army was still profoundly, stubbornly divided. The officers were almost exclusively white. The elite units were white. The prevailing wisdom, taught in the war colleges and whispered in the officers' clubs, was based on a notorious study from 1925 that claimed African Americans were a subservient race, mentally inferior, and cowardly in the face of danger. This wasn't just prejudice, it was policy. It was the doctrine that decided who got a rifle and who got a shovel. But in June of 1950, that doctrine collided with a brutal reality. The North Korean People's Army, backed by Soviet tanks and Chinese strategy, smashed across the 38th parallel. They didn't just beat the South Korean forces, they annihilated them. The American advisors and the first troops sent in to stop the bleeding were pushed back, overrun, and humiliated. The U.S. Army, fat and happy from the victory of W2, was suddenly fighting for its life in a country of steep mountains and rice paddies that smelled of human waste and death. They were pushed all the way back to the Pusan perimeter, a tiny corner of the peninsula, with their backs against the sea. Desperation has a way of clarifying things. The Army realized it couldn't win this war with the tactics of 1945. They needed shock troops. They needed men who could move fast, strike hard, and vanish. They needed raiders. They needed rangers. The call went out to form new Airborne Ranger companies, elite, independent units that would answer directly to the Corps commanders. These weren't going to be standard infantry. These men would be expected to jump out of airplanes at night, sabotage supply lines, seize critical bridges, and kill the enemy in close quarters combat. And here's where the crack in the wall appeared. The Army needed bodies. They needed volunteers who were physically perfect and mentally unbreakable. And there were thousands of black soldiers, veterans of W. and hungry young recruits who were tired of driving trucks. They were tired of being told they were second class. When the call for Airborne Rangers went out, they didn't just step forward, they surged. The Army leadership was faced with a dilemma. They could integrate these black volunteers into white ranger companies, which would violate the unwritten social codes of the time and allegedly destroy morale, or they could reject them and lose a massive pool of talent. They chose a third option, one that was cynical but unintentionally historic. They decided to create a single, segregated ranger company. They would gather all the black volunteers, put them in one unit, and see if they would sink or swim. It was the 2nd Ranger Infantry Company, Airborne. To the brass, this was likely seen as a containment strategy. Put the Negroes together so they don't infect the white elite units. If they fail, the 1925 study is proven right. If they succeed, well, the Army gets a few dead North Koreans out of the deal. But to the men who volunteered, this wasn't an experiment. It was a challenge. It was a gauntlet thrown down in the dirt. They knew exactly what the stakes were. They knew that if they were just good, they would be ignored. If they were average, they would be disbanded. To survive, they had to be the best damn unit the United States Army had ever produced. The selection process was brutal. It was designed to weed out the weak, the hesitant, and the unsure. Of the thousands of black soldiers who applied, only a few hundred were selected for training. They were sent to Fort Benning, Georgia, the heart of the Jim Crow South. Imagine the psychological pressure. These men were training to become the ultimate warriors for a country that wouldn't let them buy a sandwich in the town next to the base. They would spend their days learning how to kill with their bare hands, how to navigate through dense forests, how to jump from C-119 flying boxcars, and then they would spend their weekends navigating a society that viewed them as subhuman. The cadre, the instructors, were tough, but the men of the 2nd Rangers were tougher. They developed a culture of ferocious excellence. They called themselves the Buffalo Rangers, a nod to the Buffalo Soldiers of the frontier days, the black cavalrymen who had earned the respect of the Apaches and the Comanches. But these new buffaloes weren't riding horses. They were riding the wind. They were airborne. And the airborne tab on the shoulder was the ultimate status symbol. It meant you weren't just a leg soldier, you were a paratrooper. You were crazy enough to jump out of a perfectly good airplane. Within the fences of Fort Benning, a unique brotherhood began to form. In a white unit, a soldier might fight for his country, or for his flag, or for the guy next to him. In the 2nd Ranger Company, they fought for something deeper. They fought for the vindication of their existence. Every push-up, every 5-mile run, every perfect landing was a middle finger to the establishment that doubted them. They were driven by a collective rage that they channeled into a cold, hard discipline. Their commander was Lieutenant Warren Bing Evans, a white officer. This was standard procedure. The Army still didn't trust black officers to command elite units entirely on their own, although the 2nd Rangers would eventually produce some of the finest black leaders in the military. Evans was a good officer, a fair man who cared about performance, not politics. But the soul of the unit resided in its NCOs, the sergeants and the corporals. Men who had seen combat in Italy and France during the Bataillon, men who knew the sound of a bullet snapping past their ear. They took the raw recruits, city kids from Detroit, farm boys from Alabama, and hammered them into a weapon. The training at Benning was not just physical, it was tactical. They learned the art of the ambush. They learned demolition. They learned how to operate at night, moving like shadows. Night operations were considered the most difficult form of infantry combat, requiring supreme trust and coordination. The generals believed black soldiers were terrified of the dark, prone to superstition and panic. The 2nd Rangers mastered the night. They learned to own the darkness, to use it as a cloak. They became creatures of the night, silent and lethal. By the fall of 1950, the 2nd Ranger Company was ready. They were physically sculpted, tactically sharp, and mentally hardened by the racism they faced every day. They had completed the arduous Ranger training cycle, suffering fewer washouts than many of the white companies. They looked impressive on the parade deck, their boots gleaming, their jump wings shining silver on their chests. But a parade deck is not a battlefield. The real test was waiting across the Pacific Ocean, in the freezing mountains of Korea. When the order to deploy came, there was no hesitation. They packed their gear, wrote their letters home, and boarded the trains. They were heading to a war that was going badly. The Chinese had entered the conflict, changing the dynamic overnight. The U.S. forces were reeling. The Army needed the Rangers, not next month, but yesterday. As they traveled toward the port of embarkation, moving through the segregated towns of the South, they were a strange sight. Heavily armed black men, wearing the berets and patches of the elite, moving with a swagger that unnerved the local sheriffs and shopkeepers. They were a glimpse of the future, a future where black power wasn't a slogan, but a reality, backed by firepower. They arrived in Korea in December 1950. It was the coldest winter in memory. The wind cut through their uniforms like razor blades. The ground was frozen solid, making it impossible to dig foxholes. This was the environment that had broken the German army in Russia, and now it was threatening to break the American army in Korea. The 2nd Rangers stepped off the ship into this freezer, their breath pluming in the air, their hands gripping the cold steel of their M1 Garands and carbines. They were assigned to the 7th Infantry Division, a unit that had been battered by the Chinese offensive. The white regular infantry looked at these newcomers with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. They saw the Ranger tabs, but they also saw the black faces. The rumors had preceded them. The old lies about black troops running away, about them sleeping on guard duty. The 2nd Rangers knew they were walking into a hostile audience. They knew they had to prove themselves immediately. They couldn't afford a warm-up period. Their first missions were patrols, scouting out the enemy positions, probing the lines. It was dangerous work. The terrain was mountainous and unforgiving. One wrong step on an icy trail meant a fall into a ravine. One careless noise meant a mortar round landing on your head. But the Rangers moved with a ghost-like silence. They brought back intelligence. They engaged in small skirmishes, winning firefights against North Korean guerrillas. They were competent. They were professional. But competence wasn't enough. To shatter the stereotype, to truly make their mark, they needed a defining moment. They needed a mission that was considered impossible. And in the early months of 1951, as the UN forces prepared for a counteroffensive, that mission would arrive. It would involve airplanes, a drop zone behind enemy lines, and a village called Munsan-ni. It would be the first combat jump in the history of the Rangers, and the men of the 2nd Company were going to be the tip of the spear. The generals who doubted them were about to be given a lesson in warfare they would never forget. The mission was codenamed Operation Tomahawk. By March 1951, the stalemate of the Korean War had devolved into a gruesome, grinding cycle of taking and losing hills. General Matthew Ridgway, the brilliant and aggressive commander who had stabilized the shattered 8th Army, realized he needed to disrupt the enemy's logistics and shatter their morale. He planned a massive counteroffensive to push the Chinese and North Koreans back across the 38th parallel. The key to this offensive was a daring airborne operation. A paratrooper dropped deep behind enemy lines, near the village of Munsan-ni, designed to cut the enemy's main line of retreat and open a flanking avenue for the advancing ground troops. The Airborne Rangers were to be the spearhead of this operation. The 187th Airborne Regimental Combat Team was the main force, but the 2nd Ranger Infantry Company, Airborne, was tasked with the most critical, most dangerous objective: landing first, securing the drop zone, and establishing a protective perimeter. They were to be the first boots on the ground in the largest American airborne operation since World War II. When the men of the 2nd Rangers received the briefing, the atmosphere in the room was electric. This was it. This wasn't a patrol. This was history. They were being entrusted with the most sensitive and high-risk mission of the war. They knew that the entire army, from the officers who doubted them in the general staff to the white infantrymen who still eyed them with skepticism in the chow hall, would be watching their performance. Failure was unthinkable. Failure would not just cost them the battle, it would cost the reputation of every black soldier who would ever fight after them. The immediate preparations were a frantic rush of logistics and last rites. They checked their parachutes, their demolition charges, and their weapons. The cold was still their constant enemy. They had to tape their rifle mechanisms to keep the grease from freezing, risking jams in the extreme cold. They wore multiple layers of clothing, but they knew that once the wind hit them at 1,000 feet, the cold would be a physical punch that could knock the breath out of them. They wrote their final letters home, simple notes to mothers, wives, and fathers, knowing that a combat jump behind enemy lines carried a 50-50 chance of returning alive. The night before the jump, the companies assembled at the airfield. The air was full of the noise of C-119 flying boxcars, massive twin-boomed aircraft that looked like they were designed by children. The troops filed onto the planes, the 2nd Rangers at the front, ready to jump first. The atmosphere inside the cargo bay was thick with the smell of canvas, engine oil, and fear. White paratroopers from the 187th were packed shoulder to shoulder with the Black Rangers. For many of the white soldiers, this was the first time they had been that close to a large group of black men since they left the segregated South. The irony was palpable. In a few hours, their lives would depend on the courage of the very men they were taught to despise. The flight to the drop zone was long, cold, and terrifying. The planes were unheated. The men sat in stoic silence, looking at the black void outside the cargo door. The fear was a living thing, a cold knot in the stomach. The jumpmaster, the man in charge of the operation, checked the line, slapping the men on the shoulder, ensuring they were ready to clip their static lines to the anchor cable. The NCOs of the 2nd Company were calm, moving with the practiced efficiency of men who had seen war before. They talked quietly, reminding the younger men to count to 3, to pull the ripcord, to check the canopy. They were the reassuring anchors in a plane full of men facing the abyss. As they neared the drop zone, the signal lights came on. Green light. This was the final moment. The door was rolled back. The cold wind howled into the cargo bay, a physical shock that stole the air from their lungs. The ground below was a dark, featureless blur, a massive canvas of nothingness dotted with tiny, distant fires, the signal flares marking the drop zone. The 2nd Ranger Company jumped first. They filed out of the roaring maw of the C-119, one after another, disappearing into the black Korean night. They fell through the icy air, the sound of the plane quickly fading above them, replaced by the terrifying silence of freefall. They pulled their ripcords, and the massive canopy snapped open, violently arresting their descent. For a few short minutes, they were alone, suspended between the stars and the enemy, silent hunters descending to the ground. The landing was brutal. The terrain was rough, the snow was deep, and the men were heavily laden with combat gear. They hit the ground hard, collapsing their parachutes, and immediately plunged into the highest state of alert. They had landed in the middle of a major Chinese and North Korean supply and communications hub. The enemy, though surprised, was not disorganized. The sound of distant machine guns and small arms fire immediately cut through the night. The party had started. The mission of the 2nd Rangers was clear: secure the drop zone perimeter before the main paratrooper force landed. They moved with the silent, lethal efficiency they had practiced back in the swamps of Fort Benning. They set up their machine guns, established their lines of fire, and began engaging the surprised enemy forces. The fighting was quick, brutal, and fought at close quarters. The North Koreans who stumbled onto the drop zone were not expecting to be met by a wall of perfectly aimed fire from an elite unit they didn't even know existed. The combat that ensued was decisive. The 2nd Ranger Company fought with a cold, focused fury. They cleared out pockets of resistance, silenced mortar teams, and established a rock-solid perimeter. When the main force of the 187th Airborne began to jump, thousands of paratroopers filling the sky, they landed into a zone already secured by the silent, professional violence of the Black Rangers. The main force suffered remarkably few casualties during the landing, a testament to the effectiveness of the 2nd Ranger Company. This was the company's defining moment. They had executed the most demanding mission in the American military playbook flawlessly. The experiment that the generals had set up for failure had just delivered the entire main force into safety. The commanders on the ground and the pilots in the air could not deny the evidence. The Black Rangers had been the tip of the spear, and they had not bent. They had not broken. They had been the best. The praise that came after the successful jump was grudging but overwhelming. General Ridgway himself ordered the unit to remain in Korea, knowing he needed their unique skills. The official reports stated that the 2nd Ranger Company performed with exceptional skill and courage, suffering minimal casualties while ensuring the success of the entire operation. The white paratroopers of the 187th, who had jumped into a safe zone, looked at the men of the 2nd Company with a profound and lasting respect. The stereotypes of the past, the lies about courage and competence, were physically blown away by the wind of their descent. Operation Tomahawk was a resounding success. It severely crippled the enemy's ability to supply their front lines and paved the way for the UN counteroffensive. But the fight for the 2nd Ranger Company was far from over. Their success meant that the Army would now use them mercilessly. They were now the designated shock troops, the ones called upon when a mission was too difficult, too dangerous, or too critical for anyone else. They had proven they could take a punch. Now, the Army was going to see just how many they could withstand. The Buffalo Rangers had earned their wings, and they were about to drench them in more blood. Their journey into the frozen hell of Korea had just begun. The success of Operation Tomahawk was both the making and the undoing of the 2nd Ranger Infantry Company. They had delivered a textbook performance, proving beyond any doubt that they were an elite fighting force capable of executing the most complex missions. But in the cynical arithmetic of the military, success simply means more work. The generals, now aware of the potency of the Black Rangers, began to deploy them mercilessly, treating them as an elite, disposable hammer to smash through the most hardened enemy defenses. They were attached to the 7th Infantry Division, fighting deep in the mountainous heart of Korea. The war had settled into a brutal, grinding conflict over key pieces of terrain, jagged, nameless peaks that became monuments to senseless slaughter. The 2nd Rangers were rarely kept off the line. They were constantly on patrol, setting ambushes, probing enemy trenches, and seizing the high ground. They became specialists in what the Army called contested terrain operations, fighting where the enemy was most determined to hold and the casualties were highest. The conditions they faced were beyond harsh. The Korean winter gave way to a muddy, unforgiving spring. The frozen earth thawed into a thick, clinging sludge that sucked boots off the men's feet. They were perpetually cold, perpetually wet, and perpetually exhausted. The supply system, designed to support massive infantry units, often faltered when dealing with a small, independent ranger company operating miles from the main lines. They frequently went without hot food, fresh socks, or adequate ammunition, relying on their training and their internal bonds to survive. Their defining characteristic remained their mastery of night combat. The Chinese army, fearing American air superiority, ruled the night. They used the darkness to move men, launch assaults, and infiltrate positions. The 2nd Rangers became the counterforce. They owned the hours between dusk and dawn. They would go out on listening patrols, missions where a small squad of men would crawl into the space between the enemy's front lines and the friendly lines, lying motionless for hours, listening to the enemy's movements. This required a discipline and nerve that few other units possessed. They would return not just with intelligence, but with captured prisoners and vital enemy communications, earning them a fearsome reputation among the Chinese themselves. But while their performance on the battlefield was flawless, the institutional racism of the Army never completely relented. When they rotated off the line for a brief rest, the Black Rangers were still often subjected to the humiliating realities of segregation. They were segregated in the rear areas. They were often given the oldest, most dilapidated equipment. They were denied promotions and commendations that were routinely given to their white counterparts for similar acts of courage. This created a profound duality for the men. They were heroes to the Marines they supported and the GIs they fought alongside, yet they were still second-class citizens to the system they risked their lives to defend. This internal conflict forged a unique style of leadership within the Second Company. Their officers, men who had to fight twice as hard to get their bars, and their NCOs, veterans who had survived the humiliation of stateside training, became fiercely protective of their men. They ran their company as a closed, self-contained unit, relying on internal trust rather than external support. The Black NCOs became the emotional and tactical center of the unit. They didn't just enforce discipline, they enforced brotherhood. They made it clear to every man that their loyalty was to the man on their left and the man on their right, not to the flag of the Army that doubted them. One of their most crucial battles came during the defense of a particularly nasty stretch of terrain, known simply as Hill 581. This hill was a key observation post, and both the UN and Chinese forces poured mountains of blood into its frozen earth. The 2nd Rangers were tasked with clearing the Chinese from a heavily fortified ridgeline that had resisted 2 previous attempts by white infantry units. The mission was classic Ranger work. A frontal assault was impossible. They had to infiltrate the position at night, scale the slope, and destroy the enemy from within. The assault on Hill 581 was a nightmare of close-quarters combat. The Rangers moved under the cover of a thick, cold fog, climbing hand over hand up the near-vertical rock face. They were laden with gear, climbing through the bodies of the men who had died trying to take the hill before them. When they reached the top, they found themselves in the middle of a dug-in Chinese company. The fighting devolved into a chaotic swirl of bayonets, grenades, and fists. It was a vicious, no-quarter battle fought in the mud and the dark. The Chinese defenders, who had been ordered to hold the position at all costs, were shocked by the ferocity of the attack. They were not expecting the discipline or the rage of the Black Rangers. The Rangers fought with a controlled violence, driven by the knowledge that failure meant not just death, but the vindication of every racist lie. They cleared the ridge, bunker by bunker, until the only sound was the heavy breathing of the survivors and the cries of the wounded. They had taken the hill in a single, devastating action. The capture of Hill 581 was a major tactical victory for the 7th Division, proving once again that the 2nd Ranger Company was an elite fighting force without equal. But the very success that should have earned them respect only served to seal their fate. The Army leadership was presented with a dilemma. How could they reconcile the incredible battlefield superiority of the 2nd Ranger Company with the political and social narrative of the segregated South? The unit was a walking, talking contradiction to the prevailing military doctrine. Their unparalleled competence was, paradoxically, the biggest threat to the status quo. If a Black Ranger Company was objectively the best unit in the field, what did that say about the rest of the Army? What did that say about the Jim Crow laws back home? The Army, it seemed, was more afraid of the truth than they were of the Chinese. As the Korean War entered its stabilization phase and the front lines began to solidify near the 38th parallel, the Army began to quietly make its move. The 2nd Ranger Company, the unit that had saved the day at Munsan-ni and taken Hill 581, was too potent, too successful, and too symbolically dangerous to be allowed to continue. The Army's response was subtle, not violent, but just as final. In the spring of 1951, the order came down. It wasn't an order to disband the unit for failure, but an order to integrate the personnel into the remaining White Ranger companies. On the surface, this sounded like progress. It was technically the fulfillment of Truman's desegregation order. But to the men of the Second Company, it was a death sentence for their identity. They weren't being rewarded. They were being broken up. The unit, the unique brotherhood forged in the swamp of Fort Benning and the frozen hell of Korea, was being deliberately destroyed. The Buffalo Rangers were scattered. The men who had fought, bled, and died together were sent to different companies, different divisions, different parts of the front. The Army didn't want the unit's legacy to grow. They wanted its story to be diluted, its history absorbed, its memory lost in the general chaos of the war. They had been too good. They had proven too much. And for the 2nd Ranger Infantry Company, the price of excellence was annihilation. The warriors who owned the night were about to be erased by the bureaucracy. The challenge now was whether the American military and the American people would allow the story of the best Special Forces unit in the Korean War to disappear into the frozen dirt they had fought so hard to conquer. The order to integrate the 2nd Ranger Infantry Company was the final, devastating act of institutional betrayal. It was delivered not with a firing squad, but with a piece of paper, a clean, bureaucratic directive that effectively erased a legendary combat unit. The irony was corrosive. The Army claimed they were fulfilling the promise of desegregation, but the men saw it for what it was, the intentional destruction of a brotherhood that had become too powerful, too effective, and too visible. The men who had trusted each other implicitly, who had shared the terror of the drop zone and the blood of the ridgelines, were now being forcibly separated. The lie was simple, that the men of the Second Company were being given an opportunity to integrate into the main force. The truth was that the unit's unique culture, its earned reputation, and its collective identity were being sacrificed to maintain the power structure. The Army didn't want a unit whose excellence challenged the status quo. It wanted individual soldiers whose history could be easily diluted into a vast, anonymous whole. The dissolution was traumatic. The men who had been led by trusted black NCOs and officers were now placed under white commanders who often carried the old prejudices of stateside training. Many of the Black Rangers, who had performed flawless combat jumps and cleared entrenched positions, were assigned to menial, non-combat roles, shunted aside by white officers who viewed their very presence as a threat to their authority. Their hard-won Ranger tabs, the symbol of elite status, were often met not with respect, but with resentment. The white soldiers who hadn't qualified for the tabs often saw the arrival of the successful Black Rangers as a source of grievance, not inspiration. The leadership of the Second Company fought the order vehemently. The white commanding officer, Lieutenant Evans, understood the military and moral tragedy of breaking up his most effective unit. The black NCOs appealed up the chain of command. But the decision was final and absolute. The Army was determined to erase the successful experiment and bury the results before they could spark a wider movement for equality within the ranks. The collective strength of the Buffalo Rangers was to be scattered to the wind. What happened next became a recurring pattern in the lives of the dispersed Rangers. Their history was doubted. When a Black Ranger, wearing the coveted tab and jump wings, was transferred to a new, all-white company, he was frequently met with skepticism. Did you really jump? Did you really fight at Munsanni? The Army, by dissolving the unit, effectively erased the witness. The only proof of their excellence was the word of a black man in a hostile environment. They had to fight the battle all over again, not against the enemy, but against the insidious doubt of their own comrades. Despite the institutional sabotage, the men of the 2nd Ranger Company could not simply be unrangered. The training was too deep. the experience too profound. When they were transferred to other units, they immediately became the most competent, most disciplined soldiers in their new companies. Their discipline saved lives. In the chaos of the Korean mountains, when green troops panicked, it was often the quiet, stoic Black Ranger who stepped forward to restore order. They became the quiet force multipliers, their presence elevating the performance of the units they joined. Many of these men went on to remarkable, if often anonymous, careers. The legacy of the Second Company didn't end. It was dispersed. The seeds of their courage were planted across the entire 8th Army. They served in the most desperate battles of the stabilization phase, on Porkchop Hill, in the Iron Triangle, in the endless trench warfare that characterized the end of the conflict. They continued to prove their worth, day after day, in countless small acts of heroism that never made the official history books. But the psychological damage was deep. They had fought for the highest ideal of military brotherhood, only to have the organization itself commit an act of spiritual divorce. When the Korean War finally ended with the signing of the armistice in 1953, the surviving men of the 2nd Ranger Company returned home. They didn't receive parades. They returned to the same Jim Crow laws, the same segregated buses, and the same hostile skepticism they had left behind. They had been good enough to jump behind enemy lines, but they were still not good enough to sit at a lunch counter in their own country. The Army, having achieved its goal of suppressing the unit's narrative, tried to forget the whole experiment. The official histories of the Ranger battalions of the Korean War often downplayed or simply omitted the existence of the 2nd Company. The story of the first combat jump in Ranger history, a moment that should have been celebrated as a testament to the nation's progress, was often recounted without mentioning the race of the men who secured the drop zone. The Army was more comfortable celebrating the myth of unity than the reality of the struggle that achieved it. The men who returned home carried the weight of this institutional silence. They became the quiet, powerful figures in their communities. They were the veterans whose eyes held the 1,000-yard stare of combat. Men who had seen the worst the world had to offer and hadn't flinched. They were the grandfathers who taught their grandsons to stand tall, to never back down, and to never let anyone tell them they were inferior. The discipline of the 2nd Rangers became the backbone of the civil rights movement's grassroots leadership. They were the men who understood how to organize, how to follow orders, and how to maintain stoicism in the face of violent provocation. They had been trained by the Army to survive a war. They now used that training to survive and ultimately transform their country. But the history itself remained buried. Unlike the Tuskegee Airmen, whose story was popularized by journalists and filmmakers, the story of the 2nd Ranger Company remained a secret known only to the veterans themselves. They lived their lives, raised their families, and carried their history in silence, knowing that the proof of their excellence was locked away in a forgotten corner of a military archive. It would take decades for the truth to be fully exhumed. As the civil rights movement finally forced the Army to fully embrace integration, a new generation of Black officers and historians began to dig into the past. They found the muster rolls. They found the after-action reports that spoke of the extraordinary bravery of the Negro Rangers at Munsan-Ni and Hill 581. They realized that the story of the 2nd Ranger Company was not just a footnote. It was a foundational text. It was proof that the Army's doctrine of segregation was based on a lie that these 200 men had heroically exposed with their own bodies. The final vindication for the men of the 2nd Ranger Infantry Company came in the form of a slow, grudging, but ultimately inevitable acknowledgement. Today, the Army officially recognizes the 2nd Ranger Company as a unit of unparalleled distinction. The history of their combat jump is taught in Ranger schools. Their story has been featured in documentaries. But the triumph is bittersweet. For the original Buffalo Rangers, the greatest victory was simply being able to tell their story, a story that speaks not just of courage under fire, but of the fierce, unyielding power of brotherhood, forged in the crucible of absolute injustice. They proved that a ranger is a ranger, and that true elite status is earned in the heart, not on a bureaucratic checklist. The scattering of the 2nd Ranger Infantry Company was a deliberate act of historical erasure, yet the Army could not erase the training, the discipline, or the memory of the men who had served. The company ceased to exist as a unit, but it was reborn as a philosophy. The unique ethos forged at Fort Benning, one of hyper-competence, militant self-respect, and unshakable brotherhood, was injected molecule by molecule into the American social bloodstream. The Buffalo Rangers came home, and they didn't just take off the uniform, they put on the mantle of leadership in their communities. Think of the men who returned to the segregated South or the racially tense cities of the North. They were quiet. They were reserved. They didn't brag about their Ranger tabs, but you could spot them. They walked with a discipline that was almost intimidating. They looked you directly in the eye, a habit that was a physical act of defiance in a Jim Crow world. They were men who had stared down waves of Chinese soldiers screaming in the dark. They were not about to flinch for a town sheriff or a racist employer. The skills they learned in reconnaissance and night combat were repurposed for the civil rights movement. The leadership of the 2nd Rangers became the silent, organized backbone of local chapters of the Enchori ACP and other civil rights organizations. They understood logistics. They understood security. They knew how to maintain a perimeter during a protest march when the Klan was lurking in the shadows. They brought the controlled, non-negotiable discipline of the Special Forces to a movement that was often romanticized as purely nonviolent. They taught people how to stand stoic, how to take a punch without fighting back unless they had to defend their homes. Their training was an invisible shield. The irony of this transfer of military skill to civilian activism is profound. The Army had trained them to destroy the enemies of the state, and they returned home to use that training to fight the enemies of justice within the state. They were the men in crisp white shirts and ties, standing guard at community meetings, their presence a quiet warning. They were the strategists who organized the bus boycotts, managing the complex supply chains of an economic protest with the same efficiency they had managed patrols in Korea. Their Ranger training, the ability to operate with minimal resources in a hostile environment, was the perfect preparation for the civil rights struggle. But the legacy also took a more abstract form: the creation of a new, non-negotiable standard of black excellence within the military. The performance of the 2nd Ranger Company was so undeniable that it permanently crippled the Army's ability to use the old, racist studies to justify segregation. The black soldiers who followed the Rangers, the paratroopers, the engineers, the airmen, didn't have to start from zero. They started from the summit of Hill 581. They started with the knowledge that the 2nd Ranger Company had already paid the blood price and proven the lie. The Army's decision to integrate black soldiers fully in the 1950s and 60s, a slow and painful process, was made inevitable by the success of the 2nd Rangers and their counterparts. You cannot, in good conscience, tell a man he is unfit to drive a truck when you have already entrusted him with the success of the largest airborne operation of the war. Their legacy was a silent, irrefutable argument for equality that resonated not in the halls of Congress, but in the after-action reports of combat veterans. Furthermore, the experience of the 2nd Rangers provided a powerful, living counter-narrative to the prevailing cultural stereotypes of the time. In the popular culture of the 1950s, black men were often portrayed as simple, jovial, or cowardly. The image of the Black Ranger, stoic, highly skilled, utterly fearless, and lethal, was a quiet but definitive rebellion against that stereotype. Though their story was initially suppressed, the men themselves were visible in their communities, living proof of a different kind of truth. They were the fathers who taught their children a history that the schools would not. They were the uncles who demanded perfection, because they knew the cost of mediocrity. The men of the 2nd Ranger Company were heroes twice over, heroes in combat and heroes in peacetime. Their lives are a profound lesson in the ethics of commitment. They were committed to the ideal of the United States, even when the nation was morally failing them. They were committed to their brothers, even when the army tried to tear them apart. And they were committed to the fight for justice, which they understood was simply the final phase of the war they had started in Korea. The story's final, bitter irony is that the true acknowledgement of their service was denied to them until most of them were gone. The Army's full recognition of the 2nd Ranger Company as one of the most distinguished units of the Korean War did not come until the 21st century. It took decades of advocacy by historians, veterans organizations, and the families of the Buffalo Rangers to push the rock of truth up the hill. The official commendations, the long overdue unit citations, the inclusion in the Ranger Hall of Fame, these were victories won in a war room, not on a battlefield. But for the few remaining survivors who lived to see their history restored, the triumph was immense. It was the moment the shame of the bureaucracy was finally lifted, and the true glory of their actions was returned to them. The legacy of the 2nd Ranger Infantry Company is not just about what they did in Korea. It is about the enduring power of truth. It is a testament to the fact that you can bury a combat unit, you can burn a report, and you can silence a voice, but you cannot permanently destroy a truth that was forged in the fire of human courage. The Buffalo Rangers were not just fighting for a hill in Korea. They were fighting for their story. And through their descendants and those who refused to let the Army's bureaucratic lies stand, they finally won that war too. They proved that a black man could not only be a ranger, but could be the best ranger, and that in the history of American warfare and the history of American justice is a victory that remains total and absolute. The story of the 2nd Ranger Infantry Company is a foundational text in the curriculum of American courage, offering unique lessons that distinguish them even among other black military heroes. To understand their legacy completely, we must place them in conversation with the Montford Point Marines and the Tuskegee Airmen, the other great black military pioneers of the 20th century. The Tuskegee Airmen fought for the right to fly, battling prejudice at the highest technological level. Their weapon was technical mastery and undeniable competence in the sky. Their victory was integration into the Air Force. The Montford Point Marines fought for the right to belong, forcing the most exclusive club in the military to accept them through sheer physical endurance and logistical indispensability on the beach. Their victory was integration into the Corps. The 2nd Ranger Company fought for something far more radical, the right to lead and to define elite status. They were not asking for a chance to fly a plane or haul supplies. They were demanding the right to be the spearhead, the tip of the spear, the men who would give the orders and run the highest risk missions. They fought to prove that black men were not just fit to serve, but fit to command the most elite, decisive elements of the fighting force. Their victory was the brief, terrifyingly successful existence of an all-black special operations unit that became the gold standard for every ranger who followed. This unique positioning created a paradox. The Navy and Marine Corps initially assigned their black units to logistical or secondary combat roles, where failure wouldn't impact the overall war effort. The 2nd Ranger Company was immediately tasked with the most critical missions, the success or failure of which determined the fate of entire divisions. The generals were so desperate that they had to ignore their own prejudice, an act that speaks volumes about the level of their need. The 2nd Rangers didn't wait for permission. They forced the system to rely on them at its most vulnerable point. Their mastery of the night is a perfect metaphor for their struggle. The Army's doctrine viewed the night as a time of terror for black troops. The Rangers took that terror and turned it into a weapon. By owning the darkness, the most psychologically demanding environment of the war, they symbolically conquered the fear and superstition that the Army used to rationalize its prejudice. They became the ultimate disruptors, not just of the enemy's operations, but of the Army's own racist logic. The final bitter lesson of the 2nd Ranger Company lies in the nature of their disbandment. While the Tuskegee Airmen and Montford Point Marines eventually saw their units integrated and their contributions recognized, albeit decades later, the 2nd Ranger Company was actively dissolved, not for failure, but for being too successful. This act was a clear expression of institutional fear. Their excellence was a threat to the political order of the segregated Army. The swift, deliberate scattering of their ranks was a move to deny them the ability to organize, to maintain their collective political power, and to form a lasting, visible monument to their own achievements. The Army's message was chilling. Your competence is acknowledged, but your collective power is unacceptable. This makes the persistence of their memory all the more heroic. The men who returned home had to fight an enemy that had no face, the denial of their own history. They fought with a unique form of evidence, the scars on their bodies, the Ranger tabs on their uniforms, and the unspoken respect of the white soldiers they had saved. Their victory in the final analysis was a triumph of oral history and communal memory over the official, sanitized narrative of the state. The core teaching of the Buffalo Rangers is a profound lesson in self-definition in the face of absolute external definition. They were told who they were by the segregated military. They chose to define themselves by the unforgiving standard of the Ranger Creed. They refused to accept the ceiling placed above them. They climbed higher, not for the sake of the view, but to prove that the ceiling was an illusion. The legacy of the 2nd Ranger Company is now a permanent part of the Ranger Hall of Fame, a recognition that was purchased by decades of silence and the bloodshed on the Korean hills. Their story is a powerful, necessary reminder that freedom is never given. It is continually taken, often by those who are least expected to seize it. They didn't just fight for America. They fought for the very definition of what it means to be an American warrior, leaving a legacy that every Ranger, regardless of their background, stands on today. The final and most crucial act of the 2nd Ranger Infantry Company's story is the enduring challenge their sacrifice presents to the modern American military and to the public consciousness. Their history is not a dusty artifact. It is a living question mark placed at the intersection of meritocracy and race. We must understand that their disbandment was one of the greatest strategic blunders in the history of the U.S. Army's human resources. The Army, in its fear of political and social change, deliberately destroyed a unit of proven, peak-performing special operations troops. This decision was a direct result of placing the political doctrine of segregation above the military doctrine of mission accomplishment. The cost was measured not just in the loss of a phenomenal fighting unit, but in the psychological capital it cost the military years to recover. The Army spent the next 2 decades trying to rebuild the internal trust and morale that the 2nd Rangers had built organically in a matter of months. The lessons learned by the men of the 2nd Ranger Company were later codified by the military, but the origin of those lessons was ignored. The principles of battlefield integration, the understanding that fear and cold make race irrelevant, were bought with the blood of the Buffalo Rangers. When, years later, the Army finally and fully integrated, the success of those integrated units was, in part, a testament to the trail blazed by the Black Rangers. They were the original proof of concept for a fully meritocratic military. The institutional memory of their excellence became the quiet, irrefutable justification for the full desegregation that followed. Their legacy is also a testament to the power of the non-commissioned officer, NCO Corps. The 2nd Ranger Company excelled because its NCOs, the sergeants, who were closest to the men and furthest from the generals, were the unit's moral and tactical center. These black NCOs, having navigated the humiliation of segregated bases, understood the stakes better than any white officer. They ran a tight, professional ship because they knew that their men had to be technically superior to survive. The tradition of the fiercely independent, deeply loyal, and highly professional black NCO who demands excellence from every soldier in his charge is a direct descendant of the leadership forged in the 2nd Ranger Company. But the most significant challenge the 2nd Rangers leave us is the concept of earned citizenship. In the eyes of the segregated America of 1950, a black man was not a full citizen. His rights were conditional. The Rangers went into the frozen hell of Korea and performed a superhuman feat of military courage. They were asking America, "We have faced the greatest danger, performed the most elite service, and won the most difficult battles. What more do we have to do to earn our basic rights?" Their sacrifice amplified the moral voice of the civil rights movement. The existence of these warriors, men who had risked everything in the name of the Constitution, made the continued enforcement of Jim Crow laws an act of profound national hypocrisy. Every time a civil rights activist in the 1960s was arrested, their defense rested on the unwritten contract that the 2nd Rangers and their comrades had paid for in blood. Full service demands full citizenship. The story of the 2nd Ranger Company is also a powerful reminder of the inherent American spirit of rebellion for principle. These men were not passive. They were rebels, but they channeled their rebellion into the most disciplined and effective form possible. They rebelled against the stereotype by achieving excellence. They rebelled against segregation by proving its military idiocy. They rebelled against historical erasure by leaving a combat record so pristine that it could not be permanently buried. Their rebellion was the highest form of patriotism. Today, their story must be told, not just to acknowledge the past, but to empower the future. Every young person who faces a challenge where the deck is stacked against them, who is told they are not enough, finds a perfect mirror in the experience of the 2nd Ranger Company. They prove that the most elite status is not given. It is earned in the silence, in the darkness, and in the sheer, bloody refusal to surrender one's own sense of worth. The Army tried to erase them by scattering their ranks. We honor them by gathering their story. We defy the bureaucracy that sought to silence them by amplifying their courage. The legacy of the 2nd Ranger Infantry Company is a permanent mark on the history of special operations, a mark that reads, "The elite are defined by their actions, not by their pigment." The men who jumped into the darkness at Munsan-ni were fighting for a future they would not live to see. A future where a Ranger tab was earned purely on merit. That future is here. And it is up to us, the inheritors of their sacrifice, to ensure that the memory of the Buffalo Rangers, the men who conquered the cold, the mountains, and the prejudice of their own country, remains as sharp and as clear as the icy air above Hill 581. They were the best, and their story deserves to be heard. We began this journey with the words of a prejudiced general, a man who staked his career on the belief that a black man could never be a ranger. We have traveled from the heat of Fort Benning to the frozen hell of the Chosin Mountains, and the verdict is now undeniable. The 2nd Ranger Infantry Company was not just good enough to be a Ranger Company. It was one of the most effective, most disciplined, and most strategically decisive units of the entire Korean War. The lie has been thoroughly and permanently disproven. But the final measure of their legacy is not the hill they took, the enemy they defeated, or the citations they eventually earned. The final measure is the truth they left behind, a truth forged in the crucible of deliberate injustice. The truth is that their story is a masterclass in asymmetrical warfare against systemic racism. When the Army sent them to Fort Benning, the cost of failure was the perpetuation of a lie for a generation. The 2nd Rangers flipped that equation. They understood that the cost of their success was the destruction of the lie for all time. They weaponized their own performance. They created a combat record so pristine that it became a moral and military liability for the system that created them. Their final great victory was not against the Chinese at Hill 581. It was against the Army's own doctrine of segregation. They forced the military to choose between its prejudice and its mission, and they ensured the military could only choose the latter. The truth is that their brotherhood was an act of radical patriotism. They fought for an America that did not yet exist, an America of the future, an America that lived up to its own creed. They fought for the right to hold a rifle, knowing that the right to hold a ballot would follow. Their commitment was not to a flag or a uniform, but to the ideal of citizenship, purchased not through quiet pleading, but through the loudest currency of all, their own blood. That complex, challenging, fighting patriotism is the deepest part of their inheritance. The truth is that their disbandment was the ultimate proof of their power. The Army, in its attempt to fulfill the letter of the law while violating its spirit, destroyed the unit that had saved the day at Unwanted. This final act of betrayal was a desperate attempt to scatter the seeds of their revolutionary success. But the Army failed. You cannot unranger a ranger. The men carried their creed, their discipline, and their earned arrogance into every new unit they joined, elevating the entire force. They may have been dissolved, but their DNA became the dominant strain of courage in the combat force. The story of the 2nd Ranger Company is the story of how America, inch by painful inch, learns the truth about itself. It is a story of a nation being saved from its own self-inflicted wounds by the unwavering commitment of its most marginalized citizens. The question of who is fit to lead, who is capable of valor, and who deserves the full rights of citizenship was answered definitively, not by a single act of legislation, but by the collective, stoic heroism of 200 men on a freezing ridge in Korea. Today, the 75th Ranger Regiment stands on the foundation they built. The standards of discipline, the emphasis on night operations, the fierce independence of the unit. These are the direct result of the crucible that forged the Buffalo Rangers. Every soldier who earns the Ranger tab today, regardless of their background, is walking in the footsteps of the men who conquered the cold, the mountains, and the systemic doubt of their own commanders. We, the inheritors of this history, have a duty to perform the final act of this mission, to make their story unforgettable. We must defy the institutional silence that tried to erase them. We must honor their sacrifice by remembering not just the triumph, but the injustice that made that triumph necessary. The men who jumped into the darkness at Unwanted were fighting for the day when the word black would not need to precede the word ranger. That day is here, and it is because they were willing to risk everything in a war that was not just against the North Koreans, but against the shadow of the 1925 prejudice that defined their own army. The 2nd Ranger Infantry Company, Airborne, stands as a permanent, powerful testament to one single eternal truth. There is no color to courage. They were too successful to tolerate. They were too brave to forget. And their legacy remains a final, irrefutable command to the nation they saved. Give the best a chance, and they will always prove you wrong. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, if it made you understand the true cost of their valor, share this video. Subscribe to keep the history alive. Let the world know that the name Buffalo Ranger is synonymous with the highest form of American courage. Their mission is over. Our mission to remember them has just begun.